Thank you for joining CEDA's live stream event on the very topical issue and challenge of building green skills in Australia. I'm Melinda Cilento, the Chief Executive Officer of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, and I'm really glad to be here with you today. As many of you would know, CEDA is a leading independent think tank committed to improving the lives of all Australians by enabling a dynamic economy and a vibrant society. And sustainability and green skills now sit really right at the centre of this. Ahead of kicking off our conversation, can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm joining you from today, the land of the Boonwurrung Woiwurrung Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today, obviously, we're talking about the importance of skills that are going to enable us to develop and support a sustainable economy and the efficient use of resources in our economy and society. I thought I'd just take the opportunity to plant a seed that's sort of related in terms of skills, but also related to my acknowledgement of country, which is to perhaps ask you at some stage in the next little while to contemplate the skills that we might need as a nation to develop both individually and collectively to address reconciliation and to enable us to develop and embark upon genuine and constructive truth-telling in the empowerment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I think it's a skill that we might need to think about a little bit differently than we have in the past. But now let me move to the topic of the day, which is about how we ensure that we're developing enough of and the right green skills to power our future green economy and secure our future prosperity. We've got two fantastic speakers who are going to help us explore these issues today. A warm welcome to them. We've got Karen Kimbrough joining us from the US. She is the Chief Economist at LinkedIn, and we really appreciate her making the time to be with us. And Richard Bolt, who is the Principal of Nous Group, who's joining us from Melbourne. Thank you, Richard, for joining us also. Can I acknowledge and thank the Nous Group as well as sponsors for today's event. They've been a CEDA member since 2000, and it's a membership that I have to say I really value, obviously because they're fantastic contributors and supporters to events like this, but can I also say because they really challenge us to be the best that we can be, both through the research that we do and through the events like this that we put on. And they really challenge us to make sure that all of the work we do is the highest possible quality. A little housekeeping. As always, we like you to join the conversation through social media. So please tag us at CEDA_news if you're on Twitter, #GreenSkills. And we really like the audience to participate through the Q&A session, which means that you need to jump onto the Pigeonhole app, ceda.pigeonhole.at, with the password Green Skills. Now, once you're on the app, you can ask a question and you can vote on the question of others. So it really helps us to get to the important issues that are on your mind and drive a really stimulating and engaging question and answer session. Now, let me just set the scene for today's conversation. Before we actually jumped on, the three of us were having a conversation about skills and labour markets, and I think it's safe to say that attracting skills, building and growing skills is a topic that everyone in the developed world in particular is very focused on at the moment, and that's a broad challenge. But within that challenge, of course, is how are we going to build the right skills and develop and grow the skills that are going to allow us to tackle these really important issues of sustainability. And anyone who's got anything to do with policy or organisational performance knows that sustainability is right at the top of our priorities at the moment. And of course, there are really important national commitments, whether it's our commitments to the UN Sustainable Development Goals or the commitments that nations are making to decarbonise. So they're big chunks of priority, if you like. And sitting alongside of those, of course, are the shifting expectations of community and customers. So I think it would be pretty hard to pick a topic that was less on point than the one we're going to talk about today. LinkedIn has recently released its Global Green Skills Report, And that's really going to enable us to kick off the conversation. And so that's my perfect segue to hand over to Karen, who's going to talk a bit about that report and the insights. And then we'll hear from Richard, and then we'll be opening up for the Q&A. So with that, Karen, let me hand the baton over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Melinda, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm coming from California, as Melinda said, and I just really happy to be here. I will tell you that, it's probably no better place than CEDA to start this conversation with you, Melinda and Richard. We are really happy here at LinkedIn to share our insights that we're beginning to glean about the green evolution that's taking place in the world of work, both among the 12 million Australian members that we have on LinkedIn and the 800 million global members that we have. So I look forward to hearing your questions, and in particular hearing Richard's insights as well. But before I start, let me just very quickly also just take a moment to acknowledge the terrible impact of the recent flooding that's happened across Australia. As I said, I'm coming from California, where we have our own issues with natural disasters around wildfires and mudslides. And my heart goes out to all of your communities that have been affected out in Australia. And I just hope that this is a pivotal moment for our planet, and that we have an opportunity here today to kind of, elevate the discussion maybe and build that more resilient future together. So that let me take the rest of my time, which is probably now 9 minutes, and just tell you what we're seeing at a high level in Australia and also globally, and then I'll turn it over to Richard. So what we see when we've done our kind of green skills report is that a green transformation is indeed underway across the world. We see these trends emerging in APAC. In some places, APAC's actually lagging other parts of the world. But for Australia, that's not the case. Australia is actually keeping pace in terms of its evolution with the rates that we see, say, in the UK or the US. And if I were to kind of summarize what my takeaway would be, I would say Australia is doing well in terms of its green transformation, but relative to the world, relative to some global benchmarks that you might see in the US or Europe, but there's still a lot more to be done, and there's still a lot of challenges. So even as I'm about to tell you that I see green hiring accelerating pretty rapidly in the Australian economy, I still have concerns about whether the pipeline of greening jobs and the jobs that are even have a potential to be green, is that really growing as quickly? And I'm not sure it is. And that's probably where we want to see more growth. So we need to kind of broaden our aperture, if you will, and think about how the skills that do any job can be made more green so that we can contribute to that zero carbon kind of clean economy goal that we have. Let me start by saying just a few things about the international insights. We're already seeing this global shift on our platform. Green talent worldwide is rising. So the share of green talent, for example, has increased from about 9.5% in 2015 to a little over 13% so far through 2021. So that's a really small amount, but it's a pretty fast growth rate. If you calculate the growth rate, it's about 35% growth rate. So in the past 5 years, there's been, or 6 years, there's been a real acceleration in the share of green talent on our platform. But in fact, what we're actually seeing is that job postings put out by hirers and employers looking for green skills has gone up faster than the share of green talent has grown. So the demand is there, and I'm expecting that millions of more of new jobs are going to be created globally in the next decade. And that's going to be driven, of course, by new climate policies and new corporate commitments. And this is going to kind of fuel the demand that we're going to see in job postings for green skills. We do see the US in some dimensions leading that historic kind of shift towards more green talent. A really great example that I will share with you, just it's a US example, is that in the last 5 years, the number of jobs in the renewables and environmental sector in the US has increased by over 200%. By contrast, the rate of increase in jobs for the oil and gas sector is only about 20%. Now, of course, 200% versus 20%, I'm not explaining that, of course, there are many more oil and gas jobs than there are renewable jobs. So we're starting from a low base again. But at this pace, renewable and environmental sector jobs will outnumber oil and gas jobs by 2023 on our platform if we continue at this pace. So there's definitely a shift. And the good news is this is like a time of opportunity. We're seeing this change happen. We're seeing even job seekers kind of vote with their feet in terms of how they filter on our platform, looking for opportunities to work in the green sector or in a green role. They're looking to showcase the talent they have in terms of their skills. So that's really positive. Let me turn now to what we see specifically in Australia. Our report shows that Australia's green skill intensity, as I said before, is on par generally with the US, and it is actually above the global average in certain sectors like agriculture, construction, energy and mining, and manufacturing. So this is all really positive for Australia's green transition, meaning that when I say green skill intensity, I mean jobs that require a number of green skills just to be considered green. And in fact, when we look at Australia, excuse me, we see that green talent, meaning talent that has these green skills, makes up about 13% of Australian members. This is about the same as in the US. But of all the green talent, only 9% are women. So the gender gap continues. This is also what we see in the US. And then in Australia, again, only about 11% are millennials. That's again on par with what we see in the US. So in many ways, Australia is kind of on par with the US, but there's still a lot of challenges. There's a gender gap. We do see more green skills being acquired by younger members, but of course they don't have the experience yet, but they do have the energy and the passion. When we think particularly around like what are these skills, what are the most popular ones? It's often something I get, and how are they going to get incorporated into businesses and policies? What I would tell you is that sustainability is the number one skill, and everyone will say, well, what is sustainability? Well, it's really the ability to provide advice to organizations on how to adapt to more sustainable practices. That's one of the number one most popular green skills in Australia, followed by things like environmental science, environmental management systems, environmental impact assessment. So we're starting to see a lot more talent that has those skills and a lot more job descriptions that are asking for those skills. When we look specifically now at hiring, so who's actually getting hired, I can tell you that green hiring is accelerating rapidly in the Australian economy. And as I mentioned earlier, maybe I think more can be done. Green jobs are still just a fraction of all the hires that we see in Australia, really just a percentage or two max. And so it's really a small fraction of the total hiring that's happening, but it's accelerating very quickly. And what I would say the big challenge is not that we're so small, but that when you think about the pipeline and the process of incorporating green skills, not into just the standard jobs like ecologist or biologist, we want to see green skills permeating into other roles. Think of facilities manager, a fleet manager. These are sustainability manager or procurement manager. These are the ways that we're going to see green skills really permeate all types of roles. And I think that's where we need to go towards. I know that I want to close up really quickly. I'm watching myself on the time because I promised I would only talk for 10 minutes. But maybe I'll just give you one last nugget of fact, and then I'll close, is that, I think if we want to create this green transformation across the entire economy, be it in Australia where you are and in the US where I am, it's the same answer. We need to broaden the aperture through which we think about skills and jobs. We've got to look beyond the limit view of a green job is one where you are an ecologist, and think about maybe, what else could people be doing that involves green skills? How can they acquire them? How can they be upskilled so they can implement, more sustainable practices in any role, whether it's an architect or a facilities manager? I think the way to do this, and I really look forward to Richard's comments, is to be sure that we have some public and private sector partnerships where governments and companies are coordinating their efforts to identify the roles and sectors that can be more green, and maybe to invest in the upskilling of the workforce so that they can succeed in meeting our goals. I will stop here. I feel like I could have given you a lot more facts, but hopefully you got a sense of the message here, and I look forward to your questions. But now I'll turn it over to Richard.
Thanks, Karen. Richard, and don't worry, we'll come back with questions to get the data out there, as I'm sure they're going to come through Pigeonhole as well. Richard, over to you.
Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Melinda. And quickly, but importantly, we really also appreciate our collaboration with CEDA and the opportunity to be here and speak today. So thank you very much to Melinda and your team. And thank you, Karen. That was a really helpful and quite complimentary set of comments, the ones I like to make. And what I'll do is particularly focus on the transition to net zero emissions. And I know green is bigger than that, though that is kind of at the moment, and I think for quite some time, will be so central to the green skills sector, or the green skill imperative, if I can put it that way. I'd like to sketch what that actually looks like, because I think it's difficult to conceive of the scale and the kinds of skills that are needed without having a picture in your mind. And I won't quote huge amounts of figures, but I'll give some sense of its nature and its scale in qualitative terms, if that makes any sense. And then go to draw some conclusions, which I can say now are quite compatible with the ideas that Karen's just put forward. Perhaps I'll start by saying this is expected and has to really be a very capital intensive transformation. And apologies for speaking like an engineer, but it's quite critical to actually see it that way, I think. It's got an unprecedented investment task ahead of it. And I'm not simply talking industrial scale facilities. That will be absolutely key, but it'll also go all the way to the domestic sector, where quite a lot of investment in new things is going to be required. And I'll make the point later, it's not just new things, there's behaviours, there's a societal aspect to this, which is absolutely critical, but let's focus at the moment on that, on the capital intensity. That will include dominantly and centrally large-scale renewable energy sources, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar farms, big facilities, electrolyser facilities, which is a term that is now becoming more current, to produce green hydrogen for the things that electricity can't directly do. And we're talking here anything in Australia's context from 10 to 30 times the current renewable capacity that we've already built over the last 20 years. And if you think this transition has to happen over 30, it's kind of like saying that somewhere between every 1 or 3 years, we'll have to build what we have already built, what we've taken 20 years to build to date. Massive increase. You're talking also the large-scale processing of fossil fuels, controversially, and as a support act and a bridging act to renewables, which are the main game here, but quite a critical one, to make blue hydrogen, to inject carbon dioxide into deep formations. We can have a debate about why that's required and whether it's required, but I've become increasingly convinced it is essential as a backdrop and an important support. You'll need huge new power lines, large new pipelines carrying hydrogen, carbon dioxide, desalinated water to make green hydrogen. Ports will have to be upgraded. They'll have to be building offshore wind farms. They'll have to be exporting hydrogen and its derivatives. We'll need new fleets of all sorts of vehicles. We're very focused on electric vehicles, very important, but we're also talking vans. We're talking trucks, trains, ships, planes. They'll all need to be rebuilt or indeed new ones procured, operating on completely different energy sources and technologies. Most of that will be built overseas, but the housing of them, the refueling of them, the charging of them, maintaining of them, the operating of them will all be done here, clearly, and new skills in abundance there too. A renewable energy system will need huge amounts of storage. Why is that? Because wind and sun blow at the times they want to. We consume energy at times we want to, and the match between those two is very occasional. And so you need to shift energy between hours, between days, between weeks, seasons and years, depending upon the circumstances you confront. And that's going to require way more than our current strong fixation, important as it is, with batteries. We're going to need new systems to complement those, which probably involve green hydrogen and very large storage facilities for that. We'll have to rebuild a lot of industries. Steel is going to be made differently, aluminium and plastics and chemicals of all kinds, the fertilisers on which our food security depends, all have to be made differently, and in which Australia has significant opportunities, in fact, to increase the amount of manufacturing that occurs here of those sorts of commodities. So I've gone through all of these industrial scale facilities, but then we're talking about homes, and we're talking about offices, we're talking about small businesses. They'll need new heaters, new water heaters, new stoves. They'll need, some of that will be done with heat pumps, which is a technology not very pervasive in Australia at the moment. There'll be new skills required for that too, to put them in, to design buildings for them, and to operate them, maintain them, and to use them. We as householders will have to get used to using things very differently. We'll have hydrogen boilers and furnaces, probably in the very larger scale facilities. And that, of course, again, raises a range of issues to do with skills and safety and so forth. Our buildings will need new shells, new fabric, if you like, to become more efficient, our windows and so forth as well. Even in agriculture, new feeding systems, new animal husbandry methods, new farm machinery, all required. The agricultural system is about a quarter of our emissions. There's a lot to do there too. So all of this is just a backdrop to saying the task is far larger than we've ever really envisaged. And it's going to be very important to plan it properly and to plan the skills that are required based upon a realistic understanding of the size of the task. And at the moment you'd say, well, almost self-evidently, and this is, I think, Karen's point too, no, we're improving, we're accelerating, we're skilling up in the green sense, but we are a long way from the levels of skill acquisition and building that are required to make this really happen. And you can't, of course, do this as a skill-led recovery. You need to, in fact, create, and this is a societal we here, we need to create the drivers in government policy in particular, but not just that, in corporate practices, in investment priorities, and in our personal choices. We also need to we need to create the drivers from which I think a societal and market response to produce those skills will, to an extent, almost naturally flow, but it will also require policies and other education and training focused initiatives to back up the drivers, which are going to be more fundamentally economic and societal, to get these skills, to get these investments done, these behaviours changed, and these skills formed. Now, we already know that there's a significant calculus of or a calculation or an estimate of a skills shortage in public infrastructure. Infrastructure Australia has made this point in a recent report to which Nous contributed. I should thank my colleague Hamish Wright for some insights into that work. The transformation I'm talking about here is going to require a very much larger workforce than Infrastructure Australia estimates for public infrastructure within the demand and supply assumptions that it was working in. And the skills are very diverse. We are going to need a lot of technological skills, that's very obvious, engineering, trade skills and the like, but it's a lot more than that. We need planning, we need procurement, we need approvals to be gained. We need not only things to be built, but operated and maintained. Now we need the way to be paid for all of this with communities, with households, and that requires communication, engagement, negotiation, and other skills, which in a sense are a greening of the way we deal with each other. So I'd say this is a major transformation, and the skills are not just new jobs that are essentially technological. They are also in the way of repurposing our current activities that are in the professions and jobs that already exist, and indeed in our personal lives. But certainly there is, in the technological component of this, it will require, if I can jump on a hobby horse I've been on for a long time as a lapsed engineer, that we will need some reversal of the trend of student preferences away from maths and the STEM skills in general, to embrace the fact that the brave new world of green is going to require a lot more of those, particularly in this transitional period of the next 30 years, which is so critical in avoiding dangerous climate change. We can't rely upon migration, I think, is a reasonable conclusion. Infrastructure Australia draws that conclusion for the public infrastructure task. I think it applies even more obviously when the entire world is attempting to decarbonise in the same 30 to 40-year window. There'll be a huge global talent or global push for skills, and I see Karen nodding. And it seems to me that's a pretty clear opportunity or constraint on our ability to import the skills. There'll be some countries that are quite populous that may say, well, this is our market opportunity. We will build a very large green skilled workforce, and it will be an export opportunity for us. But there are limits to that, and we'll be one country competing amongst many for those sorts of skills, as we have, for example, in information technology. So we're going to have to do a lot of this with our own people, with our own human resources, however you want to express that. It will come with wage pressures, and it will also come with the need for considerable internal migration. So not only do we need existing workers, workforce entrants, school leavers and so forth to make, on average, new choices to build a new balance of workforce, a new structure of our workforce, but we're also going to need significant internal migration, because much of what is needed to make the green economy work is going to happen away from where most of us now live. It will not be enough to just say, look, the old fossil fuel workers, they can retrain, because in many cases, there's a lot of overlap. The new stuff has to be in place before the old stuff closes. So it's not going to be possible to do two jobs at once. So that's not some kind of panacea, although it will be part of the solution. And in any case, many of them are heading towards the end of their careers. And so this is more than anything else, a new workforce, not simply an old one repurposed. And I'll finish simply by saying that as well as these additions to the workforce, this restructuring that I've mentioned, this kind of rebalancing of our current skill composition, the new skills and behaviours of a green economy and a green society are going to be required of all of us in the workplace and in the home, in our work practices, in our housing preferences, in the way we use energy, even in the food choices that we make and our choice of travel modes. Reskilling will be pervasive, vocationally as well as professionally. And so I just wanted to make sure that we understood, that we think about it, not simply as new jobs of a particular character, but something that is also quite pervasive beyond those new jobs. And that's probably enough from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. And there's an awful lot in what you've both managed to deliver in a pretty short space of time. I thought where I might start and try to pick up a bit of the tone of some of the questions that are coming through is just to try to unpack this in a bit, so I've got a bit of structure around it, if I could put it that way, because I think what I've heard from the two of you is that there is this broader sort of competencies, green talent, broad skills, if you like, and then there's new green roles that sit within organisations, and then there's this whole bucket of like new jobs, if you like, that sort of, Richard, I think you were talking a lot about in terms of particularly the transition around decarbonisation and renewables and the like. So, and I think there's really important questions that sit within each of those, if you like, and then there's a really important question about how we actually how can we plan for this, and what are the structures that we need to put in place. But let me start with one of the questions that's come through with a lot of votes to you, Karen, which is around, in that first bucket of sort of just talent and skills, what are the sort of competencies that sort of sit in that bucket broadly that you're seeing more demand for now, that sort of sit in that green skills space?
Yeah, make sure I'm off mute. I would say that the skills that are, I mentioned a couple of them that have to do a lot with like being able to advise on sustainability. But if you dig in a little deeper, what's in that bucket of skills, just generally speaking, is a lot to do, and I'm going to speak globally for a second, if I may, but it's a lot to do with everything from helping services, financial services and corporate services make that transition so that everything that they're doing, even from their facilities and the way their buildings are set up to the way they manage their vendors and suppliers, is done more sustainably in a green way. So there's a lot of skills around ensuring that corporates, I think, can meet their commitments for targets in the future. We're seeing a lot of skills being sought after in the space that's more directly what you might think of as green. So in terms of wastewater treatment or renewables. These are just really standard, what I would almost call classical green skills. And then finally, there's a whole bucket of skills that's really unusual. Like, I don't know, they just sort of caught our eye when we were looking through this. You can imagine we have like 800 million members. So there's a lot of data and there's a lot of noise. But some of the things that did catch our eye were just a little odd. Like there was a lot to do with intense green skilling in architecture and in fashion. Sustainable fashion was a thing that who knew, but that is suddenly, there's a groundswell of interest in that for those kinds of skills. But I want to come back and I'll conclude here, is really just, I think there's a twin transformation happening. And Richard was speaking to this idea of like the technology that's going to be required to accompany this movement towards more sustainable practices in whatever the industry is. And I do think it's going to require just a fundamental base in the STEM fields and in technology, in new technologies that Richard was speaking of, and that we're sorely lacking. And I would say we being globally, there's a lack of that talent, and there will definitely be a hunt for it.
One of the things that sort of I was trying to sort of get my head around, if I had this right, in the way you were sort of describing the skills and what you're seeing in the data, and this was this maybe a distinction between what this advice piece and what you might think of as execution. So the advice piece around thinking about strategy, setting up the processes and systems, and I noted through your report that things like compliance skills and related to sustainability are really growing. And I'm just wondering if there was any sort of picture that was told in your data around where Australia is at compared to other countries, in that, are we at the beginning of the phase where we're seeing really strong growth for demand for that advice piece, or are you starting to see jobs that are more about the roles and new jobs and execution? Is that something that you're able to sort of glean through the data?
I'll take a stab at it. I'll be honest. It's hard to say. What I can tell you is that the fastest growing jobs in Australia are things like director of risk management or, power systems engineer, where they might be, in the past focused on certain types of, energy, but now they're kind of actually more focused on, renewables. So it's almost as if like every job is greening at a different pace. And where I will leave you is, I think we're still in the earlier stages, but it does depend on the sector. In some cases, it's growing really rapidly, the adoption of green technology and green skills in the agricultural space, for example, in Australia. And in construction, it's another place where we see a preponderance of hiring of green talent because they're using, more modern techniques to build structures. And so in some sense, there are certain sectors that are moving faster than others. But in the big picture, if we look at all of the hiring, I'll just say, like, think of all the hiring that happened in 2021. Half of the hiring was for jobs that were not green, for people that weren't advertising green skills. So half of it is just not even playing in the space. The other half of it can be split up between jobs that are really what I would say explicitly green, whatever that ecologist job or the, wind turbine engineer job, but that's like 1%. And the rest of that 50% bucket is sort of moving towards being more green, but it's an evolution. And I would say we're still in the early stages of it. And the problem is, and here's where I'll stop here. The problem is that when folks make a job transition, as we all do normally after whatever it is, 3, 5, 7 years, many people are staying within that 50% bucket that is not green, and they're not adopting green skills. And very few people are moving into the greening space. And what we need to do is see more transitions towards greener jobs, and also people acquiring green skills so they can pivot. Because what we see is that when you do have green skills, you get hired more quickly. We see a faster hiring time for folks who have green skills than folks who do not. And that's a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah, I think one bit of data that we had released on the CEDA stage earlier this week too, that's really relevant, is that 40% of leaders here surveyed in Australia saying they don't have the skills and the expertise that in-house that they need to actually deliver against their sustainability commitments. So I think we're seeing a lot of, very rapid shift in community expectations, stakeholder expectations and investor expectations, and organisations are responding to that. And then all of a sudden, I think, very quickly running into the question of do we have the skills and capabilities to actually deliver against that? And, as I said, more than 40% saying that they don't, which then begs the question, Richard, I'm going to come to you, is how do we plug this gap? And, at CEDA, we obviously, we think immigration is part of the solution, but it's not the only piece in the puzzle, if you like. But if we're looking at domestic skills and building our own skills and experience here, let's start with the role of universities and TAFEs. That's one of the questions that's come through. And the question to you, Richard, is: are unis and TAFEs ready for this shift? And what are you seeing? Are there examples that you can point to where you think we're seeing that evolution? Or
I think the university and TAFE sector is alive to the fact that they're going to need much more content and, if you like, much more, pardon the expression, people passing through courses that are more green in their construction. I think the evidence at the moment would be that there's a large appetite for that amongst students entering universities. I think universities are pretty well acculturated to wanting to provide that kind of education. I think that the preconditions are there. What is possibly more lacking than anything else, and I think this goes a little to what Karen's been saying, is are the drivers out there that actually provide work for a large influx of green skills? Are all those drivers actually present in government policy, in the work of major investment funds and so forth, and developers? And there I'd say that it's still very much a work in progress. We do not have a policy suite, if you like, that is sufficient to produce net zero, a fully circular economy, and the various other components of a green transformation. And until that happens, that will have some constraint, I suspect, on that demand constraint will affect the extent to which choices are made to take part in greener courses. But I think what's needed is really that green is pervasive. This idea of a circularity imperative is not something that can be specialised in so much as built into everything that we already do. I'm not sure it's a case of we need a whole lot of new vocations, and I don't think anyone's necessarily suggesting that. It's more a case that pretty well every one of us has to understand the world very differently. And so I'd say the kind of reskilling job that is needed here is much more pervasive than a university or a TAFE system itself can handle. They do need to do things like, for example, in hydrogen, there are new technical skills required that are not present currently, are not built into courses. But again, if you built one now, then it would be a case of limited demand, and therefore it would not necessarily be a particularly lucrative kind of training to engage in. So I think what we need to see is to leverage an existing preference and a growing willingness, both in the education sector and in the student body, to take part in this has to be matched by a pull from the market. That pull has to come from this grand collaboration between governments and the private sector. And that, I think, is still a work in progress. It's building, but it's nowhere near of sufficient scale and momentum to produce the transformation we're looking for.
Karen, you mentioned in your comments, a sort of PPP sort of, government and business being in this together to tackle these skills challenges. And there's a couple of questions that are coming through, looking for some insights, if you like, around, what is the role of employers? How do we, and to your point, Richard, around reskilling, how are we thinking about, micro credentialing, and how are you seeing that, Karen? And what sort of model, do you have, or what's your thinking around that? And are there signs that you're seeing from members and employers around the things that they are doing and the sort of career and skills development opportunities that they're creating?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we're seeing is there's three things I want to call out. One is a far greater emphasis on credentials, and both by employers and hirers who are willing to accept not just those who have degrees, but those who can just sort of demonstrate that they have the skill through experience or through a credentialing program that's not necessarily a typical degree from an academic institution. And so I think there's starting to be a push towards skill first, which is exciting for us. And then I think we're also secondarily seeing that, and I'm going to give you a US example. I apologize for that, but I'm just more familiar with the US than I am for Australia. So forgive me for this. We are seeing here in the US, like a desire to create skilling programs, but then the problem is the local jurisdictions don't know what to teach. They really don't know what the right skills are. And so where the businesses need to come in is they need to help design the curriculum that actually meets their own needs for what they want to hire. So we're not seeing as much, I would say here, the apprentice model, though I have talked to members of Congress about it, but we are seeing more local businesses getting involved with local job training schemes to help people get the kind of targeted specific training that they need. And then here's the last thing I'll say, which is it seems like we're still a long ways off from being where we need to be in terms of skilling people. We did see through COVID that people are more willing to kind of skill themselves online, a lot more hours watched naturally, and a lot more willingness to try to learn things through online courses. But I would say I feel like we're just scratching the surface. And the problem is that most people don't know exactly what skill they need to get that next role, or get the correct skill for that green job that they want. And it's a very untransparent kind of market right now.
Yeah. Richard, what are your thoughts there on the role of business in this space? And to be honest, it's a conversation we've had about skills more broadly in terms of how do we get ahead of skills demand, and, you know, is business good at predicting this? Do we need something that's a bit more thoughtful in a partnership with government? What's your thinking on that, Richard?
I think business certainly has a critical role in defining, exactly as Karen has said, what skills it's going to require. But of course, then it is dependent upon having a license to pursue certain lines of business, which is generally in this area particularly policy driven. So it needs to engage in the policy debate. It needs to communicate its requirements into the education system. It needs to build, I suspect it needs to build programs internally to give people work experience that's relevant to all of this, perhaps to a greater extent than has been typical through the more, you know, the kind of micro reform years of the 90s onwards. I think that that this notion of a kind of societal responsibility to build skills, even if you don't as a business ultimately, particularly larger businesses, even if you don't capture those particular individual skilled people, but you're doing this as a contribution to a public good of which you are part. I mean, it sounds terribly preachy, it sounds really old-fashioned, and yet it sounds unavoidable that businesses do actually take on that aspect of social responsibility with gusto, particularly those that are large enough to do it, and provide the kind of work experience, the green work experience, but still practical, economically valuable as well as green work experience that builds this next generation of workers, where this capacity is, to go back to my earlier point, pervasive, not specialised, not somebody in an investment house, they're the green person, everyone else goes on doing BAU. No, everyone needs to be, in a sense, green aware, green capable, and thinking about an economy in very different ways to those that certainly my generation was brought up with. So yeah, critical role for business, certainly a very important partnership with government. Now, what I feel is lacking particularly is the big picture, which is never going to be an absolutely clear crystal ball of what does the green economy look like in 2050, 70 and into 2100. It's more, however, that we can identify the major trends which appear the most prospective and socialise those in ways that are highly communicable, in which people can understand from the point of view of whatever their lives are, whatever they aspire to do. What is this going to mean for me? What are my choices and options? Where will I have to adjust? Where might I want to make some new directions? it's that picture of the future that I think is one of the big missing pieces. We're very much navigating in the dark with no helicopters, no drones or anything to show us what the landscape ahead might look like. And I say again, it's never going to be a completely clear picture, but there is a case to do that a lot better than we have been doing it, so that people can make choices, companies can make choices that are informed by a clearer sense of what the future looks like.
Yeah, I'm going to try to take that answer. One of the questions that's got the most votes is around, besides full degrees, what kind of continuous learning can assist workers? And I think that's what you've just talked to there, Richard, is that a business is going to have to be involved in helping inform curriculum, and there'll be curriculum that evolves according to new green jobs that emerge. But more broadly, there's going to be these competencies, more general, generic competencies that are going to have to cut across all curriculums, and that business has a role to input into that. But and whether that's through a full degree course or micro credentialing, that's the relationship that we need to see. But then there is this role for business just around its own the development of its people, and I guess a bit of a public good argument there. I mean, I think I've got a question about that, because typically what we see is when there's a huge public good element to it, we get underinvestment, whether that's, capital, financial capital, or built capital, or human capital. So I think there's an interesting policy question there about, will we get enough of that absent something else?
No, and I think the answer is we won't. So I agree with your basic premise. But even where, the corporation is willing, the funding might be weak, if I can paraphrase, in the absence of what governments only really can do, which is providing incentives and providing, in a sense, direction. That can be through regulation, it can be through subsidy, it can be through mandates of different kinds. But there is a really strong role for government in partnership with, not simply doing everything on a centrally planned, directed basis with a reluctant corporate sector and a reluctant community. It has to be a grand partnership of all three. That government has got a very clear role to socialise some risks, to set certain directions, as I say, and to redirect some public resources into areas that make it possible for a company and an industry to invest and prosper in a green world. But certainly when you're starting whole new industries, and there's plenty of that going to be required in a green economy, then that kickstarting capital has got to an extent come from government. But it's got to come with a genuine commitment from the private sector to play its part. It's not a case of, each pointing fingers at the other. It's a case of joining their efforts to make something bigger happen.
And Karen, you're nodding there, so jump in.
I did want to jump in, and I'm probably going to state the obvious, but I, just agreeing with where you're going, Richard, and saying that, part of the challenge with the skilling is that skills are transferable, so people can, whisk them away. And so it's really not much of an incentive to want to invest a whole lot of really special, highly sought after skills in someone who's going to be able to port them off somewhere else. And that's part of the challenge. And that's part of the reason you need government to be playing a role to subsidize that.
What the businesses can provide is a workplace. They can provide work experience. They can reform their own investment priorities and do various things that sit within, their basic responsibilities to, in the end, still earn a reasonable return. But to do all of that and still contribute in a pretty fundamental way to building this new green workforce.
One of the obvious incentives, of course, in all of this is pay. And I'm quickly scrolling through my questions, trying to find the question that had come through earlier, which is about, Karen, what are you seeing in the data? What is your expectation around remuneration for these jobs, or for people who have demonstrable core competency in green skills? Are you starting to see a REM uplift? Is it something that you're expecting to see? And is that, a signal that we need to see more of?
Yeah, I wish Melinda, I had more to say on salary. We don't often, the salary data I look at is just the publicly available salary data. It's not our own. So I'm going to defer a little bit. Maybe Richard has more to say, but what I will say is, what I mentioned this earlier is that we do see faster hiring rates. So the rate at which members are hired when they apply, for those with green skills. And so it suggests a certain resilience on the one hand, through the business cycle. And on the other hand, it also suggests that they may be more in demand, and therefore possibly likely to command higher wages. But that's me sort of speculating upon speculating.
I think the other thing I could observe is that in a tight skills market, there's a lot of talk about employee value proposition and what you're offering to potential employees or your current employees. And we're seeing this real push on sustainability. Now, I would expect that you're going to see that part of the quid pro quo is going to be employees looking at what the sustainability credentials of our employers, but then also what is the opportunity for them as employees to develop those skills as well. So whether it's in pay or whether it's in career development and career opportunity, I feel like that's what we're starting to see already.
I would agree. I'll just jump in one more time. I would agree absolutely with that. That is something we do see is one, a real desire by younger members on our platform to work at a place with purpose. And we had a whole exercise, I didn't mention it here, about looking into like how recent grads are going into more green sectors more eagerly than even a few years back, or even than older members. They definitely are looking for a sense of purpose, but they also want to be invested in. And so when we ask just members generally worldwide, not just talking about green right now, like what is it that's going to attract you and keep you at a company? Obviously, wages and benefits are part of it, and the flexibility. But the other part is investing in my career path, so that what's in it for me. And this is a reflection of a very tight labor market. We were just talking about how tight the labor market is in Australia. We have employment growing and unemployment at record lows, and so I think they're able to command and demand investment in their skill sets. And so we're at a moment where, as long as that lasts, we're seeing job seekers looking for the opportunities, not just in title, but also in what experiences am I going to have? What skills are you going to train me in?
Yeah. I've got time for one more question I'm going to try to bring both of you into, and I'm sorry to the audience, I'm trying to mesh two questions together here. There's a question from Michael to you, Karen, around, with the countries that did surprisingly well in terms of the growth in green jobs, and I know you sort of said Australia is sort of up there, but New Zealand is picked up in this question around how is New Zealand doing, for instance, or are there countries that you would sort of call out and say, in general, they're doing really, really well, or they're doing pretty well in a particular aspect? And I'm going to join the second part, which is you talked about diversity. I have to say I was really surprised around the gender gap, because typically when you see surveys, the female respondents tend to be more engaged on issues of sustainability as a general assumption or conclusion. So I'm just interested in is there a country that's doing better on diversity? And then a question to both of you around how do we tackle this diversity issue, particularly if it's tied to STEM skills, which is something that we've always struggled with. So perhaps Karen, to you first in terms of the survey, and then Richard to you.
Yeah, sure. So we didn't design the report to be comparable. So, in a horse race, is Australia ahead of New Zealand or not, or the US versus Canada, to pick another proximity rival. But we did, of course, see that Australia and New Zealand were both doing really, really well, and were on par with trends that were kind of seen in the UK and the US. And by the way, I don't think the US should be the benchmark. I think we can do better than what the US is doing. So I feel like we still have a kind of a low bar that we're benchmarking ourselves against. I would probably say that the most important thing in terms of diversity, look, there's one thing I would say. One thing that we're seeing is that younger people are choosing to get degrees in environmental sciences more. And so I think there's going to be more gender parity at younger generations than we see in older generations. But generally, there still is a really big gap. I can't think of a country that's done particularly well. I promise I'll take that away and see if I can find one. And I think some of it has to do with the technology. That goes hand in hand with that twin transformation of technology and green evolution, but it's hard for me to explain it. There's still quite a sizable gender gap.
Richard, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I've been debating this since I started my professional life, really, Melinda, since I left engineering at a pretty early stage of my career, despite having been treated pretty well. I found the culture and the practice, the attitudes so off-putting. I wanted to do something that just had more social responsibility, environmental responsibility, public good, while being completely simpatico with the idea of it being done in the private sector. It just wasn't the place for me. And it's been pretty stubborn. In the core engineering world, my sense is, and Karen might correct me on this, but my sense remains that it's not moving. The needle hasn't moved a lot towards inclusive and towards diversity, and particularly to gender diversity. Part of that, I think, is an ingrained view, which is different in some other countries, about the suitability of women to STEM roles, which if you go to Iran, for example, which is a really odd example to give, but it's a really potent one, you see these high-performing women coming out of Iranian universities, and they are really skilled in the STEM area. That somehow is okay in Iran. It's less okay here. But I think it's kind of this gap is kept in its box by workplaces that are not particularly kind of inclusive in their language, in their practices, in their attitudes, in the environments, the physical environments they create. I think a lot of a reinvention is needed to make the workplace more open and inclusive and inviting, but the work itself also more clearly a human social endeavour, not just a kind of build something and that's the extent of it. So to give an example, I guess, a particular case, I think that the ability of those who are going to build the next generation of infrastructure, which I'm very focused on, as you can tell, I know the issue is bigger than that, but it's where this problem is greatest. The ability to engage with communities and at the same time provide not only an inclusive workplace, but really, if you like, an inclusive solution, is not yet pervasive or built wide into the engineering and construction sector. And I think there's something in that. They've got to kind of engineer like people matter more, like communities matter more. And I think that would make them more attractive. And I think that would help open the door to the notion that this is a genuinely interesting place in which people with a social conscience, people with an eye to the future would want to work. And I think women would find that more attractive.
Could I jump in? I know you have 1 minute left, but I just quickly looked up some facts real quick, and it looks like there's been no improvement in the gender gap. And it also looks like men from our data are actually moving at a faster pace into green jobs and greener sectors. And maybe it is sectoral because it's agriculture and construction and manufacturing. But,
yeah. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. We are out of time. I knew we were going to race through this. It's such a fascinating topic. For the audience, one of the things I just wanted to mention was you may have seen that CEDA is establishing an ESG community of best practice. What we've heard today is that obviously skills are going to be really critical to that whole ESG agenda. And so whether it's within that community of best practice or alongside of it, I expect that we can continue to deliver really important insights and work, and that's going to be a priority for us to sort of see that work through in terms of the thinking about it, but also the capacity of organisations to execute. So there's that. Karen, I have to say there's a question about whether LinkedIn could do a survey related to this. So I'm just going to put a pin in that, but note that there is appetite to better understand what's going on, particularly in an Australian context. So we'll take that on notice as well. And just a final quick observation from the commentary and questions. Kerry, thank you for your observation and sort of remark or question around sort of picking up on the custodianship of land of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and perhaps we learn from that in a sustainability context, which is, of course, a very obvious and important point to make. Fantastic conversation. I think how would I sort of draw a big bow around it? Huge challenges in front of us, but also tremendous opportunity where we're going to have to set the right incentives and signals. It's business working with government, and everyone's going to have to play a role in that. Again, I'm going to do a bit of self-promotion here. That's CEDA's sweet spot. So I think you can look forward to us continuing to drive this agenda. For anyone who hasn't been paying attention, there is a mountain of work that the events team has been doing here at CEDA. Jump online at ceda.com.au to have a look at the other events and programs that we've got coming up, because there's just some really great conversations and content that's being developed for the benefit of our members and other audience participants. So thank you again for being part of this conversation. Karen, thank you for joining us from the US. Richard, thanks for your great contributions, but also again to Nous as sponsors of today's event. And I think that's it, other than to say, for those of you who've logged on to Pigeonhole, please give us your feedback. You can give us a rating on the event experience, and we're trying to make sure that we're improving the quality all the time. So please do that. And that's enough from me. Thanks again. Look forward to catching up on a future live stream.